Okay, welcome class. So today we're going to run through how to render our line drawing in Photoshop using textures and shading. So what you're going to need to start is we're going to need to have Photoshop open. We're going to need to have your Google open at in a Chrome or an Internet Explorer browser. And we're also going to have your scan of your line drawing of your house open in Photoshop. So what you can see in front of you now is a finished version of this basic texture added to this basic house. So this is essentially where we want to land by the end of the tutorial. What we're going to learn here is how to incorporate layers into your Photoshop work, how to add textures to a three-dimensional surface, how to utilize layer masks, and how to add shading using the brush tool. So what we're going to start with is, if we go back over here, we have our basic scan of our basic house, which you need to have open in order to start this. What you'll find over here is we have our background layer, which as you can see is locked. We also have open our history and our colors. So history is going to come in very important because it allows you to scroll through what you've done and go backwards and forwards in a undo, redo type manner. If you don't have these windows open, you can go to Window and you can very easily find your history and click on it, or you can find your layers, so forth from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by duplicating this layer into a non-locked file. So we do this by right-clicking and clicking Layer from Background. Now, when that happens, you go New Layer, and we're going to name this layer the House Line Drawing. It's very important to start naming your layers. The reason behind naming your layers is as you get more and more layers, it becomes harder and harder to understand which layers have what on them. So we'll click OK. So now we have a layer instead of a background of our house line drawing, which we're going to utilize shortly. So the first thing that we're going to do is, what you do with layers is you can change what's called the blend mode. In this case, we're going to change the blend mode to multiply. The reason we do that is it essentially tells us that every layer underneath is only going to have the black on that layer overlaid over the top of it and not the white. That's going to make more sense in a second. Now what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in a little bit. So if you hit Control and the plus sign, you can zoom in so that we can get our house nice and large on our page. Now we're going to go over to Google, and it's time to select our texture. So I'm just going for a weatherboard texture at the moment. However, feel free to go for a brick texture or a concrete texture or whatever texture you feel is going to work. We'll go into images. Now we need to find a texture that is going to be able to cover the entire side of the house. So this texture, of course, is far too big for the house. The texture also needs to be perfectly flat as well. See how these lines are horizontal? If you pick a texture with angled lines, you're going to start struggling to add it to turn it into a nice 3D texture. So I'm going to keep cruising through and seeing if we can find a really nice weatherboard file that we can utilize. So you also need to make sure that the file size is quite large. See, let's utilize this one for the time being. So this is a nice raw timber. The lines are reasonably straight. So this is something that we can definitely use. It's got this Alamy stock photo down the bottom, so we're going to need to cut that out. But what we'll do is we'll copy that image, we'll move back across to our Photoshop, and then we'll paste that over the top. So first things first is let's remove this alarmy stock photo. So we're going to use our marquee tool. It's called the rectangular marquee tool, and it's designed to simply make a selection. So we're going to select, in this case, the stock photo weather thing, and we're going to hit the delete button. And then just click away to deselect. So now what we have is we have our texture, and then sitting below that we have our house line drawing. So what's important now is that we drag and drop our texture to sit below the house line drawing. Now this is where what we did before was multiply. See how now only the black lines are showing up over the top of the texture? If you were to convert that back to normal, the white would sit over the texture as well, and of course you wouldn't be able to see anything underneath it. So let's change that to multiply. What we're going to need to do now is you double click on the layer, and we're going to name this layer Right Wall Texture. So what we can do now is we have the texture and we have the line drawing sitting over the top. So first things first, we need to drag that texture into roughly where we want it to go. So it's this wall that we want to place the texture on. So let's go grab our move tool and let's just drag it roughly into place. So this is where we start using our transform tool. So what this is going to do is it's going to it's going to allow us to distort this texture to make it conform to the 3D surface which it's sitting on. So let's start that by going Image, Edit, Transform, and there are a number of different ways that you can transform. However, in this particular instance, we're going to use perspective because essentially that's exactly what we're doing. So if I drag that out, see how it's making the left-hand side larger and the right-hand side remains the same. So we need to make the left-hand side the height of the house. So line that point up, drag it down a little, line that point up. And then what we can do is we can drag this up, and then we're shrinking that down. And drag and shrink. See, what we've got now is we've got this beautiful line that lines up perfectly with the perspective lines of the house. However, as you can see, it hangs over a bit. So to get out of this, once you're happy with how you've transformed, simply double click on the image and you're out of the transform zone. So as you can see, we've got this little bit hanging off the edge here. So we need to address that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to address that using what's called layer masks. So what we need to do is we need to put this texture into a layer group. So we'll do that by going Layer, Group Layers. So now, as you can see, you've got this layer and it sits inside this group. So what we need to do now is we need to select where we want this texture to sit inside, which is of course the line drawing. So in order to select it, the simplest method is to use our Polygon Lasso tool. So that's going to allow us to create a little marching ant marquee around the edge. Click at the points, click, click, around exactly the surface of this right-hand side wall. When you hover over the final point, as you can see, this little O appears. So we click on that and that closes off this layer. Now, as you can see, we have a marquee here. So making sure that our group is selected, we can then go to Layer, Layer Mask, Reveal Selection. See, this means that the what's inside this little box that we've selected is going to be shown and anything outside is going to be hidden. So let's click on that. And there we have it. So what we've got now is we have this group, and inside that group is our texture, and we have it beautifully added to the face of this wall. What we can do now as an extension on that is to create a new layer, which is down here. We're going to name this layer Shading. And while we're at it, let's name the group Right Hand Wall. So we'll click on the shading, and now what we're going to do is the shading is where we start adding in some shadowy details. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to select our brush, and we've got this big brush. So let's maybe shrink the size of the brush just a little bit to say 495 there. The hardness is how soft the edge is. So if your hardness is down at 0, you get this really soft edge. If the hardness is way up to 100, you get this really firm and fixed edge. So we're going to want a nice soft edge because we're trying to add a nice soft shadow. So once you've configured that, just click out of it, and we need to select our black color. And what we can see now is we're adding some shading in. So you're just clicking and dragging where you want this shadow to go. So you're just gently feeding in these shadows. So as you can see, what that's done is it's created a pretty dark shadow. So what we can do there is, first things first, is we want to change our blending mode to multiply. See how that changes it slightly? When it's normal, it grays out what's underneath it, but when it's multiply, it looks much more like a shadow. It blackens the blacks. And also you can adjust the opacity a little bit as well. So if you drop that, as you can see, that's a really dark and harsh shadow, or you can create a really subtle shadow. So let's sit it somewhere around the middle. And there we have it. We have a group with the right-hand wall. We have our house line drawing up the top, and we have done our very first wall.